In many ways, it's increased costs, but in many ways, it has also increased competition, which is reduced profit margins, right? So one of the big innovations in U.S. banking is fintech, and this is, we've talked about this already when we talked about the bond market, right? But most of the things that we talked about in the bond market also apply to what's happened in banks, right? You can go online and you can go to Rocket Mortgage and you can type in a couple things and you can have 100 different banks basically give you a bid for a mortgage, okay? So yeah, on one sense, that's cut costs for banks because now they don't have to do this in person, right? They don't have to go out and drum up business. But on another sense, you can see how competitive the market's become, right? When you don't have to just go to the local banker to borrow money, you can go to anybody in the world. Right? So fintech has definitely changed things, right? Credit cards and ATM, or credit cards have been a huge innovation, right? Because this, once again, created this whole new set of borrowers for banks, right? Huge new set of borrowers. This increased return, but it has also increased some risk. Because who are a lot of these borrowers through credit cards? Well, they're people that may not be the best credit risk to begin with. Second big one, we talked about this morning, is commercial paper. Increasingly, it's banks that borrow in the bond market, not just other firms. But once again, if you think about it, and I won't repeat it, I'll just draw an arrow here. This has cut costs for banks, but it's also increased their competition. In the sense that, yeah, now banks can borrow from the commercial paper market, but who else can borrow from the commercial paper market? Firms can, right? So firms don't have to go to banks. They can just go to the commercial paper market too, or many firms can. So, once again, banks have increasingly found themselves raising money in the bond market, but in competition with the bond market, right? In competition with the bond market as well. One of the most obvious ways this has happened is the development of the junk bond market. So remember, junk bonds are not junk, right? They're just high risk, high yield bonds. Right? They have higher default risk. And as a result, they have higher interest rates in general. This is really any bond that's graded BAA or below is a junk bond. But this has really opened up a way for smaller, newer firms can borrow without going to banks. So the junk bond market is really a direct competition with banks. In the old days, the only way that these firms could borrow money is through a bank. Now you can go to the junk bond market. Right? money market mutual funds. Okay. These are mutual funds that hold short-term securities, maybe that. These are often offered through banks. So you can, through a bank, you can open a money market mutual fund. And what does that mean? Well, if you put $10,000 in it, what's the bank going to do? It's going to go take that $10,000 and literally it's going to buy 10,000 shares of the money market mutual fund, right? So usually shares in this are $1 each, right? So this has been, once again, to this recurring theme. The development of this money market mutual funds has increased the viability of the commercial paper market because what's held in these funds? Commercial paper, largely. So banks can raise more money because more people are putting money in the money market mutual funds. But of course, when people put money in this, what are they not doing? They're not putting it in a savings account or a checking account, right? Which is the traditional way that a bank has raised money. So let me say this again, just so we're clear. In the old days, banks raised money largely through checking accounts and savings accounts. Now what are they doing? They're raising money through commercial paper. Why has that market gotten so bigger? Because they also offer individual depositors the ability to put money in a money market mutual fund, right? So the setup is different, right? The setup is different. Once again, this has made it cheaper for banks, right? This is a cheaper way of raising money, but it's also created a lot of competition for banks, right? Created a lot of competition because now, as I said, a lot of firms can go to the commercial paper market and they can raise money. They don't have to go to a bank. Okay, let's talk about securitization. Securitization. We've talked about this a little bit. We will talk about it more here over the next couple of days, but let's make sure that we really understand this because it's going to be hard to understand a lot of what's going on in the US financial market without understanding a little bit about securitization. Okay, what is securitization? I don't know if I gave you a formal definition of this when we talked about it, but the formal definition is turning an illiquid asset into a marketable liquid asset through the process of standardization. Okay. The most obvious, now any kind of asset in theory could be securitized, right? Many different types of assets are securitized. But the most popular kind of asset to be securitized is mortgages. Okay? So let's go back to the old days, right? 1970s. You wanted to get a mortgage for your house. What would you do? You go to your local banker and you'd say, I want to get a mortgage. And your local banker would say, well, okay, but it's kind of hard for me to raise money for 25 years and to put this mortgage on my books, so it's going to cost you, right? And more than that, I'm going to require at least 20% down to make sure I'm safe, right? So you're going to have at least 20%, maybe 50% down, right? And that wasn't uncommon, right? In China today, if you get a mortgage, most mortgages, you need between 20 and 50% of the money down. So it was expensive to get a mortgage. It was, you had to have a lot of money down, so you had to have really good collateral. And the thing is, that mortgage would just sit on a bank's balance sheet for the life of the mortgage. Why? Well, honestly, because mortgages are hard to sell, right? If you've, probably none of you have gone through the process of getting a mortgage, but first off, they have weird prices, right? Usually you'll borrow, $142,863.19, right? It's a really weird price. Nobody knows anything about your house, right? I mean, most people who might buy it have not seen your house, particularly if you live in a place like Mount Vernon. They may have no idea what the real estate market is, right? Most real estate markets are very localized. And so there's a lot of local information that you don't know. The other problem with mortgage is that many people pay them off early. Okay? So that's bad from the perspective of a lender, or from a lender, because if you give your money to somebody for 25 years, you may not just want that money back next week. And that's one of the problems with mortgages, is people often pay them off early. And so there's all this kind of idiosyncratic stuff about a mortgage that makes them not very attractive. But the good people at Goldman Sachs in the 1970s had a nice idea. And that was, sure, one mortgage is very unique and idiosyncratic. But what happens if I get 100,000 mortgages? Now I can begin to apply diversification and the law of large numbers, right? So yeah, one mortgage has a weird price, but what happens if I get 100,000? All that stuff washes out, right? And if I get 100,000, I can say definitively, within a little small margin of error, how many of those will get paid off early. And also I can diversify. I don't have to worry about what's going on in Mount Vernon's market, because I'm just taking the national real estate market. And so it became obvious to many people on Wall Street that one mortgage was not attractive, but holding a lot of mortgage, holding a pool of mortgages, was really attractive. So how do I raise the money to do that? Well, I issue a standardized marketable liquid asset like a bond. I issue bonds. I use that revenue to buy up mortgages. Where does the money come from now to pay those mortgages? Right? Or I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I issue bonds. I take all that money. I buy mortgages, right? And then how do I pay the interest on the bonds? Through people's mortgage payments, right? So people send me their mortgage payments. I take those mortgage payments. I pay the interest on the bond. And of course, if I do this right, I keep a little bit for myself. And so these things were hugely popular. Basically taking individual mortgages and turning them into mortgage-backed securities, MBS. These things are standardized, diversified, and as the ad said, safe as houses. Who love these? Everybody. Pension funds, right? Mutual funds, right? Everybody wanted to get in on this business. And what it did in turn then was it meant that a lot more mortgages could get issued because so many people wanted to buy these mortgage-backed securities. That meant that you needed to have more mortgages. And so all of a sudden, people could get mortgages for lower interest payments with lower down payments. This was a huge boon to most people, right? This was a great thing. Of course, you can't have too much of a good thing, right? And we'll talk about that as we go along. But increasingly, the hunt to get more and more mortgages led them to begin to go into what's called the subprime market. And the subprime market is really a nice word or a nice phrase for people with high default risk, right? And as more and more of the money went to these people with high default risk, it basically undermined the whole system, right? In the process we'll talk about. Crucial to this was the government, right? Government was very important in this. In part, making sure that all of these mortgages were kind of standardized to some extent, and also providing insurance on some of these mortgages so that when they went into these bonds, they were safe enough so that these bonds got rated high enough by the credit rating agencies, right? So crucial in this process were a couple of government organizations referred to as Ginnie Mae and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Why these strange names? Well, they're basically lingo for the acronyms of these companies, right? Ginnie Mae is GNMA, and I can't even remember what these acronyms stand for. Fannie Mae is like FNMA, and Freddie Mac is FMAC, I believe. But these are federally licensed organizations that provided insurance on mortgages. So if you had, let's say that you borrowed less, or if you had less than 20% down payment, typically in the old days, banks wouldn't lend you money without 20% down. But they might lend you money if you had 5% down and you paid for this insurance. And so these companies provided insurance. They also made sure that the mortgages met certain standards so that they could be securitized easier, right? So really made this process a lot easier. This primarily has happened through mortgages, but as we're going to talk about, it could happen for anything. Could you take mortgage-backed securities and then create a mortgage-backed security squared, which is just bonds that are comprised of nothing but mortgage-backed securities bonds? Sure, and people did that. So mortgage-backed securities bonds that, as their backing, have other mortgage-backed security bonds. Sure. Could you take car payments and securitize them? Sure. Could you take David Bowie's song catalog and securitize it? He did, right? To the tune of about 40 billion bucks, right? And what's true about all of these things? You have a relatively illiquid asset, like the money that David Bowie makes from the song rights, and you turn it into a liquid asset, which is a bond, right? And how do you make the payments on the bond? The money that comes in through his, song rights. So yeah, this can happen across any number of different sorts of assets. Unfortunately, as we'll talk about more, this process went south, as we all know. And partly it went because over time, people paid less and less attention to risk, to the fundamental risk that were in some of these mortgages, and figured, well, if we get enough of them, we can just diversify all the risk away. What's the chance that the entire US housing market would go bust at the same time? Well, we know what the chances are, and it hit in 2007. So part of the problem was they just had too much risk. But the other part of the problem, and we'll see this kind of repeatedly, is financial markets are really good at making things complex. So complex that sometimes complexity is the objective, so that people don't know what's going on, right? And so that's often what happens, is that ideas that turn out good oftentimes become bad as they get so complex that nobody really understands what's happening. A classic example of this is the next thing that we'll talk about, which is financial derivatives. Right, financial derivatives. What is a financial derivative? Well, once again, there's lots of examples of things that are financial derivatives. But to get an idea what they are, you have to kind of understand the definition. And the definition is really simple. It's just an asset whose value is derived from another asset. Listen, mortgage-backed securities are a financial derivative. Okay, securitization is an example of a derivative. It's bonds whose value is derived from a mortgage. But financial derivatives are a much bigger umbrella, and they include a lot of things. Okay, a good example of a financial derivative is what's called a credit default swap. Okay. What's a credit default swap? A credit default swap is basically a contract that you enter into. And if your bond defaults, somebody will pay you money. Okay? So I could enter into an investment bank and buy a credit default swap on, let's say, General Motors bonds. And so if General Motors bonds default, then the institution, like let's say it's Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs would pay me money to cover my losses, or they would pay me money, okay? So does that sound a little bit like insurance? It's a little bit like insurance, but only if you own the bonds, right? So if I own General Motors bonds and I buy a credit default swap, that credit default swap is like insurance, it's protecting me. But what happens if I buy a credit default swap and I don't hold any GM bonds? What am I doing? I'm speculating, right? I'm speculating. So these things can be basically a way to insure, or really a way to transfer risk. You can use them as insurance to reduce risk, or you can use them as a way to speculate. Okay, this gets way beyond the scope of this class, but it is crazy how complicated some of these financial derivatives can become. Just want to show you a little picture here. Hold on one moment. This picture is almost impossible to understand, and that's kind of the point. But this is basically kind of a representation here. Too big, probably. Of how complex these mortgage-backed securities, some of these mortgage-backed securities became. So, like I said, this is really, it's almost impossible to read. But what you had down here is mortgage originators. These are the people that could originally issue a mortgage, okay? And they could be different kinds of mortgages. Oops. Shoot. Oh, this thing is so screwed up. It's kind of hard to get it on my screen and up here, but we'll try. It's just a little easier to, well, maybe it's not. Anyway, so these are the mortgage originators, right? And then what they would do is they'd sell it to an investment bank. What would the investment bank then do? Well, they would turn it into many different types of mortgage-backed securities. So there's this process by which you could take a bunch of mortgages, and depending on how you split it up, you could split it up into higher risk mortgages and higher risk bonds that had higher return but more risk. Or you could have lower risk bonds that had lower return. This was called tranching. We'll talk about this more on Wednesday. But tranching is basically breaking things into risk. Then you could take some of these bonds and you could then use those and combine different sorts of mortgage-backed securities into another fund in which you could make what's called a mortgage-backed security squared, right? Where you take a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and then you could issue them, right? You could issue new bonds that were backed by the second wave of mortgage-backed securities. Then you could have credit default swaps on all of these bonds. It would create a whole new class of assets that could be traded, right? Then there were things called mortgage-backed securities cubed, right? Which are mortgage-backed security bonds that are comprised of mortgage-backed security squared bonds, which are comprised of originated mortgage-backed security bonds, which are comprised of bond mortgages. That make any sense? Probably hardly, right? And I mean, we could just keep on going on and on here, where all of these things were broken up into different tranches so that you could have any sort of variation of risk and return. And it became almost impossible, even for experts, to understand what was in these things, right? And so, yeah, this I mean, as a practical matter, it was almost impossible to figure out what is in some of these things. And so I say this because this is just another example of how complex modern banking has gotten, right? This is not the guy waiting till 4 o'clock so he can get to the country club anymore. This has greatly increased the risk of banks and increased the returns to banks. Why? Because banks sell a lot of these things. And let me talk about one more thing, and then we'll stop here for the day. Off-balance sheet activities are, as a pretty self-explanatory, activities that don't show up on a bank's balance sheet. These are things like one-time transactions that don't permanently impact the assets or the liabilities. Things such as a loan sale, like a mortgage origination. Okay, so I got my mortgage here at Mount Vernon Saving and Loan. How long did Mount Vernon Saving and Loan hold my mortgage? For about 2 seconds. And then they turn around and sell it. So they get a fee for that, right? But does that show up on their balance sheet? No, because they're really not using any of their assets or liabilities. It's not changing their assets or liabilities. It's just like a fee, right? A lot of banks are involved in trading activities where they're selling things like selling financial derivatives. Or they're selling futures. Or they're trading in the foreign exchange market. The key to all these kind of things, and we could just keep on going on. There's so many different things now that banks are involved in, right? The key, though, is that you can't tell the risk a bank is exposed to. By just looking at their financial statements. Banks oftentimes in these trading activities have exposed themselves to a great deal of risk. But you can't tell how much risk there is. Sometimes these traders will speculate and take huge risks, but you can't tell what those risks are just by looking at the balance sheet. And so there's some pretty famous stories here that have happened over the last 10 or 15 years of traders basically going rogue on a bank, opening the bank up to huge losses by which nobody had any idea what was going on, right? Probably just to kind of pick a couple of the more famous ones, Nick Leeson, right? I think this one was from like 20 years ago. But Nick Leeson worked for Barings Bank, which is the second oldest bank in England. You don't know about it because it went bust, largely because of Nick Leeson. One trader, he made some huge bets on the Japanese yen, including a huge bet that the yen would go up right before the Kobe earthquake. He lost Barings about $1.5 billion on his own, and Barings ended up going bankrupt. The most recent one is Jerome Curvel, who works for Societe Generale, which I think is like the second largest bank in France. He made some bets and lost them about $7 billion. And there was kind of a worldwide manhunt for this person. They eventually caught him in Singapore, and he's in jail. And you know, sometimes I don't even think that these people, at least in the case of Jerome Curvel, he didn't really even mean to like steal money or whatever. He just thought he was making a good bet. But when there aren't really good controls on your traders can open you up to huge risk, and you just can't tell. Nobody from the outside, even people on the inside, can't often tell what's going on. And so once again, this kind of stuff increases your return, but it increases the risk of banking, right? And that is definitely the theme, right, of most of chapter 11, right? So when we come back on Wednesday, I still want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about shadow banking a little bit more because we need to kind of understand that concept a bit more. And then we'll talk a little bit about whether it's a good, we'll talk a little bit more about bank consolidation, how banks are getting bigger, and we'll talk about whether that's a good thing or not. All right, so that's kind of the last couple of topics for chapter 11. And then we will move on to Michigan chapter 12, which is talking about banking crises, right? Why do banking crises occur, right? So that will be the deal for Wednesday. But before then is the exam tomorrow, right? So are we all clear what's on the exam? What chapters? 1 through 7, right? Basically, everything we did last week, what we talked about today will not be on the exam. Well, or let me put it this way. Some of the topics we talked about today, we did talk about last week, but I'm not going to be asking purposely questions about this for your exam, okay? 2.5 hours, so we'll start promptly at 9. I think a couple of these other rooms are open. So given the long period of time that we have, my hope is that we can actually spread out a little bit just to be safe. So we'll try to do that. I'll be here a little bit before 9 and we'll spread out as much as we can. If some of you feel comfortable doing this, you might also be able to go down to the lounge downstairs. It might be a little bit noisier, but if you're somebody that the noise doesn't bother you, we could also do that to spread out. We'll kind of figure that out tomorrow morning, okay? Other than that, I think I said what I could about the exam this morning in class. So does anybody have any specific questions? Yeah, Brooks. No, you have to memorize them. I mean, there's not, I wouldn't say there's a lot of formulas. It's mainly, and most of the formulas are more related to present value, future value. So my hope is that you understand them more than memorize them, if that makes sense. But yeah, you will have to know those. Probably the thing that comes closest to a formula is the Gordon growth equation. And yeah, you should know that. How about other questions? No, you just ready to go? I understand that. I understand it. Okay, well, I'll check my email probably till about 9 o'clock tonight. And so if questions come up, you can send me an email. Also, I'll check my email in the morning. So if you have some last minute questions, you can send me an email and I'll answer it before class tomorrow, right? But if not, I'll see you back here. Remember to bring a calculator, right? You can't use your phones. So remember to bring a calculator, bring some writing utensils. I think that's all you need. Okay, good luck studying tonight.
Are these calculators allowed on the test tomorrow?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I've had classes that didn't allow calculators in the past.